We came to Christ in university, college students, at the age of 19, and we were always passionate to serve the world and make an impact for Christ. And so eventually it led us to, we spent a year in Central America learning Spanish, and then planted a church in New York City in 1987. And I just loved your videos up there, because that's very much the heart of our church as well. And so as this church was moving along, by year 5 or 6, it had grown to a decent size, actually, and lots of great things were happening. But something was clearly wrong and we couldn't quite figure it out. Now, initially, I was looking at everybody else in terms of something was wrong. And so, Bob just mentioned the iceberg. We put that iceberg up for just a second. It's a nice image that we use a lot. I know you use it at this church as well. It's a nice way of looking at discipleship that, above the iceberg is 1/10 of what you can see, but 9/10 is below the surface. And when we think about our relationship with Jesus Christ and discipleship, it's not just external change above the surface that we're interested in. Jesus was very much concerned about the heart. Mm-hmm. And so yes, we're going to church, we're not cursing anymore, we're being nice at work, we're reading the Bible, we're praying. That's above the surface change. But we're after beneath the surface, that when we're under stress, behind closed doors, when we're in intense conflict. And I realized by year 6 or 7 of our church that we were recycling the same old problems in our church. And especially under stress. And that people were not changing deeply. They were changing just superficially. And so I tried every discipleship paradigm I knew. And, we were like, we like to say we were evangelical poster childs in terms of we did everything you could do to learn, to grow, and be disciples of Jesus. But something was missing in our own iceberg, in our own discipleship, and we couldn't quite figure out what it was. And at the same time, in our own life, some things started to crumble. So it wasn't just out there in the church, it was actually internally. And so I was exhausted, stressed out, we were gaining the whole world, but I was losing my soul. And at that point, I was in my mid-30s, and I remember a pastor in the church, and I'm saying to myself, oh God, get me out of here. I was praying for retirement and some way to get out of this intensity. Now, again, our church is located in Queens. We've got 73 countries in the church. It's a lower, it's a poorer area. So very, big ministries to the poor. So it's a high-intensity environment. And I was like, oh God, get me out of here, because I'm kind of blaming all this external stuff. But then secondly, one of our congregations that we planted had a split, and 200 people had left and planted a church down the street. And I felt very betrayed by this fellow, and I hated him. I loved him in Jesus' name, but I hated him at the same time, I wanted to kill the guy. So I had all these feelings going on inside of me of bitterness and rage and anger, and I didn't know what to do with it, because I'm supposed to be a pastor, and I'm preaching about love, but I got this hate. And people are praying for me, they're casting it out of me, all that kind of stuff. I'm like, God, get it away. And I realize I'm in a crisis because I don't know what to do with this loss, this grief, this pain. I don't have any theology for it. It's outside the grid. And at least up to this point, the Christianity that I knew about following Jesus, it just wasn't working anymore. And then at the same time, Geri, my wife, and that, we had 4 daughters at that point, she was very unhappy being married to me. Can I say, and she's saying things, but I'm like, yeah, and
you're saying, no, he would pull out the God card. But didn't God call us both to this? And, what do you say when they pull out the God card? That's hard to read.
So the God card ran out, and
it did.
In January, so when things were starting to fall apart, I like to say that when you're broken, really broken, you'll learn from anybody. And I used to say, I'll learn from a frog if it speaks. I'm like, just somebody that can help me with what's going on inside of me. And so I started this inward journey in 1994 when we had this Spanish split, these 200 folks left. And I started to look inside what's going on inside of me. Maybe I'm part of the problem. And I'm working on this for like 2 years, but it's all inside. But Geri comes to me on January 2nd, 1996, and she says to me, Pete, your leadership stinks. And I don't want to follow this anymore. And so I quit. And I'm going to another church. Now, It's a real problem if you're the senior pastor.
Now, the way I heard the story in one of your books is that she stood up on the bed in the middle of the night over you at 2 a.m. and announced, "I quit." Almost like an appearance of God in the room or something.
Yeah, it was like that.
Believe me, it was God. It
Yeah.
was God.
And actually, I don't think
God
she's...
in skin.
It was God in skin. So, you know when you think you're at rock bottom and you find out that's not the bottom? There's like a whole nother bottom below the bottom. And that's what it was like for us. But when she quit, she had my full attention.
Finally. We, as Pete mentioned, we became followers of Christ in college, and then fell madly in love several years later, and really were excited about serving Christ in New York City. So we moved to New York City, no people, no money, found an apartment in the New York Times, and started planning this church, really through evangelism, etc. So over the next 7 years, the church was being birthed, planted, and established. And anybody who knows anything about any kind of startup, including a church, it's a lot of hard work, and we had a lot of other complexities. But so we're working hard, and we're going 24/7. We're also birthing, at the same time we're birthing an English congregation, we birthed a Spanish congregation, and we're birthing babies. Over this time we're birthing daughters, and we're birthing churches. And I don't recommend those at the same time, because they're both a lot of work. But as the time is going on, and he's exhausted, I'm exhausted, and we have people coming into our lives with lots of problems, but there are also problems within the body of Christ, the conflicts that wouldn't get resolved, etc. And I just began to get tired, and actually I had a lot of anger, at these unresolved things. I had anger, I had sadness, I had disappointment, and I had shame about having those feelings. Because I didn't think good Christians, and especially good Christian pastors' spouses, should have those feelings. So I just kept, I wouldn't even acknowledge them to myself. And they just kept getting pushed down and depressed until it turned into a depression, really to an extent where I didn't even recognize myself anymore. But it was out of that depression that it got me to a place. It had a silver lining because I didn't care what anybody thought anymore. I'm tired of pretending everything's fine when it's not. And so that's when I went to him and I said, this church no longer brings me life, it brings me death. I quit and I'm going to another church. But that actually would turn into be an incredible blessing because it forced us to get some help. Because we had even just logistically, what church are the kids going to go to? But much more important was we had decisions to make about our lives, the church, because our decisions were going to affect a lot of people. So we go away and we get some help from really some wise mentors. And what happens in this time with these mentors is we begin to see, because when we went there, I went to fix the kids, I went to fix the people in the church, I went to fix New York City. He went to fix me. And, so then we could get back to the work of the ministry. But what was the big revelation for us was the problems were not out there. Actually, the problems were inside of us. And I learned that actually if you have a lot of conflict out here, it's because you have a lot of unresolved stuff going on the inside. And so what I learned was, oh my goodness, the church is not the thing that I needed to quit. There's a lot of things that Geri Scazzero needed to quit, a lot. I needed to quit being afraid of what other people thought. I needed to quit lying, especially to myself. I needed to quit dying to the wrong things. I needed to quit denying anger, sadness, and fear. I had to quit all this faulty thinking I did. I always say, Christians, we do mind reading and assumptions of others, like the air we breathe, and it really wreaks havoc in relationships and in the church. And so there were just many things that I needed to quit. And if I had been quitting those things, I really would have never had to quit the church. So we've learned that although we had been Christians and leaders in the church at this point for 17 years, we had great gaps in our spiritual formation, in our discipleship. And there was some embarrassment and shame in that. Like, how could we have not known this? And so that launched us on a journey to really to begin to integrate this missing piece, which we call emotionally healthy spirituality, so that we really could become spiritually mature.
Before we go any further, why don't you tell them, to give them a picture of pre-EHS. Last night you told a story about the pool, faith in the pool. Why don't you tell us? It's a great story, great picture.
So just to give you a picture of what my emotionally unhealthy spirituality looked like a couple years earlier. At that time, we had 3 daughters, 3, 7, and 8. It was a hot July day, and I was there for 2 services. Pete would come home after the Spanish service. So by the end of 2 services, 3 kids, and I'm doing children's church, and I'm exhausted. So I get home, finally get the kids down or resting or whatever, feed them. And then Pete calls me and he says, "Hey, honey, we have this couple friend, actually they're friends of a pastor friend of his from another state nearby, had friends visiting our church. And so now he felt obligated to spend time with them. So he called me and said, "Hey, would you mind if they came over for lunch, after the 3rd service around 3 o'clock?" Now imagine, you have to imagine, New York City apartment, no air conditioning, as hot as anything. I'm exhausted, and I say, "Sure, of course, okay. But on the inside, I was saying, "No, I don't want, no, I'm exhausted, and now I got to think of food, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." So they come, and these folks are there, and they begin talking and talking and talking and talking. And I'm feeling, I don't even know what I feel. I just know I don't like what's going on here. But I was trying to give a presence of kindness and niceness. I didn't want to interrupt, because interrupting I thought would be rude, and then they might think we're rude, and I didn't want them to think we're rude. I want them to think we're nice Christians. But all of a sudden, this is going on for a long time, and all of a sudden I realized I haven't heard the kids for a while. And especially, I wasn't worried about the 7 and 8-year-olds, but I was worried about my 3-year-old. So I'm smiling, looking like I'm engaged in the conversation. But I'm beginning to feel anxious. But I can ignore it. But now at some point, I'm actually can feel panic. I mean, it got to a point of such panic in my body because I couldn't hear my 3-year-old anymore. And all of a sudden I thought to myself, the pool. And I jumped up. I just jumped up and left the conversation. And first I said, "Oh Lord, let her be in the living room." She's not in the living room. "Oh Lord, let her be in the basement." She's not in the basement. And then because the last place I want to look is the yard. We had a little postage stamp backyard, and it had a pool that was 3 feet high. And I run to the window and out into the yard, and there is my 3-year-old. She had somehow gotten her clothes all off, and then she went up this rickety ladder, got herself in the pool, and she was standing with just her chin above the water. And I realized if I had been 5 minutes later, to this day, it rocks me of the tragedy and the irresponsibility, because of our irresponsibility, because of our misunderstanding of what it does mean to be a nice Christian. But I couldn't say no. There were so many things that taught me, and it would take 2 more years till I really realized that all these things that I thought were being a good Christian or spiritually mature or nice were not. They were actually my desire to have that person's, if they're okay with me, then I'm okay with me, so to speak. And, my failure to interrupt, my failure to have boundaries, my inability to say no to him. Today's not a good day. And I was just like, holy smokes, here we are thinking that we're spiritually mature because we're leading a church, and yet we were emotionally children.
And that's something in the book. You actually have, some tables, some tests to take
Yes.
to measure your own
Excellent.
EQ, your emotional maturity. And what you were finding, what we found, is actually while we're spiritually, 40 years old in Jesus, physically, I won't tell you how many years in physically, but emotionally you could be like still 12.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's why these things are happening, lying, which is not outright lying, but it's failing to say what you really think, which is a form of lying.
Right.
And denying grief and loss and sadness and burying anger. And then you found that ordinary discipleship had no categories to deal with this, and that set you on the journey.
Yeah, and so what happened was, this all broke loose in '96, and God met us really in an extraordinary way. And I like to say, I was an emotional infant pastoring a church. Trying to raise up mothers and fathers of the faith, and my discipleship was just too narrow. It was missing large portions of scripture to it. And so this kind of revelation was, and you put that thesis up, that emotional health and spiritual maturity cannot be separated. That it's not possible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. And I realized that was the reality with myself. This love verse, for us, is the nice summary of EHS. 1 Corinthians 13:1 says, if I have the gift of, moving mountains and faith that can move mountains and solve all mysteries and etc. But I don't have love, I've got nothing. And I realized that the mark of spiritual maturity is loving well, is being a person who loves people, who's approachable, who's soft, who's open, who's honest. And I wasn't any of those things. I had a wall up. My family, we focused on doing production and work. And my criteria of what was maturity was all mixed up. And so 1996, we got launched in this journey we do call emotionally healthy spirituality. And our lives have never been the same since in these last 21 years. And it's evolved into what does it mean to do a discipleship that deeply changes people so that for the sake of the world and impacts everybody around them. And it's really been the best 21, 22 years now almost of our lives. For me as a father, as a husband, as a person, as a Christian, as a leader, it has been unbelievable. And so our journey has been writing, thinking, and bringing this to the church about a discipleship that's not just attending church, not just even going to a small group or serving. It's about letting Jesus into your life deeply, access into all of it, and letting him transform you. We have a little saying that says, Jesus may be in your heart, but grandpa's in your bones. Jesus may be in your heart, but grandpa's in your bones. When we receive Christ, yes, he's living inside of us, but discipleship is getting grandpa out of our bones, because what lives inside of us is our families of origins and our cultures going back hundreds of years. And that's the hard work of discipleship that Jesus did with the 12 for years, for their transformation. There's no getting around coming out of slavery and going to a promised land. There is a discipleship issue. That is what it means to be a Christian. And we realized that we needed to call people to discipleship for the sake of their own freedom, to become who God called them to be, to make their contribution to the world that God intends them to make.
Yeah. And you, I think you filled in a gap that happened in church history in a way, because in the Old Testament, there was a lot of contemplative life. The Psalms, David reflecting, most of the Psalms are sadness, laments. And then Jesus, he took a lot of time to be with the Father, to contemplate. So, and even in early church history, the contemplative life, slowing down, Sabbath rest, reflection, meditation, prayer, it was huge. And then the active life, was balanced with it. And then somehow within our modern evangelicalism, the contemplative life began to shrink, less time being, and the active life just began to grow. And we get that in this culture because this is a doing culture.
Absolutely.
But I feel like you brought us back to something that even, for the first 1,000 years of the church was huge. It goes all the way back to Psalm 51, where David said, "You desire truth in the innermost being, in the hidden parts. You will make me know wisdom." Talk to us about that, the pillars of the being side of things, because your whole thing is about how to restore that union with Jesus, and then how it plays out into loving others well. Talk to us about how you've built this model.
You said that so well. You just
because I've learned from good people. I've studied this. I've read these books.
Well.
It's just...
If you've got that picture of it says slow down spirituality, it'd be good to put that up on the screen. And what we did was we ended up taking a 4-month period because we realized that unless people slow down to be with Jesus, that we're simply reshuffling chairs on the Titanic, that nothing's going to change. Because any fruit that comes out of our life, Jesus said, is going to flow out of our relationship with him. And so we spent some time learning from outside of our own tradition about silence and stillness and being with Jesus and Sabbath. And again, it was like another conversion for us. And yeah, we live in New York City. I mean, it's a madhouse there, but we found out it's a madhouse everywhere. And you know the story of Mary and Martha in Luke chapter 10, where Martha's busy and active and making sure she's working like crazy, but she's missing Jesus. And she's complaining, but Mary is sitting at his feet, listening to what Jesus says. And Jesus says, your sister Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. And so there is this balance we have in life. We're all active, we're here, but we are called first to be about being with Jesus. And so a big thrust of EHS, or emotionally spirituality, is not just this emotional component, becoming aware of what's going on inside of us, learning to feel and bring that to God, and how our families have impacted us in grief and loss and those kinds of things. It's also a slowed down spirituality where I'm actually cultivating a first-hand relationship with Jesus and not living off other people's spirituality. That was another big shift for us and has really changed us.
Stuff like taking Sabbaths, and you told us the other day that on Sabbath you have a lot of disciplines, but one of those is you always drive in the right lane. And I'm like, I can't believe you actually do that. On Sabbaths, you drive in the right lane.
We have to slow down in New York City.
Wow, that's convicting. I don't know. I mean, just stuff like that. You've built disciplines into your life to slow down, to become more self-aware, dealing with reactions, journaling,
Right.
Bringing these things then into relationship. Instead of like, oh, if Pete would change, we'd be okay. It's more like, why do I do that when you do that? I mean, it's a whole way of life.
It is.
I like the diagram you use of the building. The leadership book is really powerful. Talk about that, how the difference between the beneath the surface life and then the active life above.
Yeah, so I think you've got also a slide there of the skyscraper. And I'm sure many of you have been to New York on vacations in Manhattan. The island of Manhattan is built on granite or rock. And so when they build the skyscraper, they've got to put these steel beams, or they're called pilings, deep into that granite. And sometimes they will put these steel beams into the ground, into the rock. They'll go down 20 stories in the ground before they start building. And you'll hear, if you've been in New York, Manhattan, they're pounding. You hear pounding with this machine all day long because they're putting in those pilings. And then they build a skyscraper up. But we have a construction engineer in our church who helped me, who taught me that, Pete, that there's been times they've not put in the pilings or the steel beams properly. They were sloppy. And as a result, they started building the skyscraper, or they finished building it, and the building started to lean. Or cracks began to emerge in the wall, or the windows wouldn't open, and they've had to either lift up the skyscraper, and they could do that in a few cases, or tear the whole thing down and start all over again. And it's a nice image of, and this book is about leadership, it applies to all of life, that if I don't have an inner life with God and with myself, and I'm out here doing all this stuff and building, there's going to be cracks, and your life is going to lean, there's going to be problems, and especially comes out if you're in any kind of business, corporate, church leadership, or leading a family. And so we identified some issues that have to be in our lives and settled if we're going to actually make and have a life that's fruitful for God. It was face your shadow is number one. That's the first piling. That means you're self-aware of what's going on in your life. We were not self-aware at all. And
So, for example, shadow, I know, for example, for the first 17 years of my Christian life, I was, with that verse, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow Christ. But I was denying the wrong parts of myself. I was denying self-care. I was dying to my love for the outdoors. I was dying to time with my extended family because we were building the church and all those kinds of things. And what I realized was I wasn't dying to my shadow. I wasn't dying to my defensiveness, to my unapproachability, to my need to be right, to my fear of vulnerability. Those are just some aspects of my shadow.
Yeah. And our shadows come primarily out of our families growing up and our cultures. And we just actually, we end up passing on the same sins from generation to generation because we never were just so unaware of them. But you can't break what you're unaware of. You can't change what you're unaware of. And it's a painful process initially, but going that road, I remember because our family had a lot of pain growing up and abuse, and I didn't want to look at it. But it was actually very much informing my present. But I found that once you go in that iceberg, you go into that hole in a sense, Jesus is waiting for you there. And I found out that he takes those wounds and he actually heals them, delivers us, and there's resurrection in there. And like the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, Joseph had a lot of pain and trauma, actually, in Genesis 37 to 50, but he ended up being a blessing to the nations. We believe very firmly God's called all of you in this room and us to be a blessing to the world. And it's going to come out of the unique family, the moment in history you were born, the country you were born, the family you were born into. God knew that in his sovereignty, because he has a much larger purpose for all of us. But we've got to be willing to put it in his hands and look at it for what it is. Grieve it for where necessary, but offer it to God and let him take that and put us on plan A again. So, that's first.
What are those other three pylons? Because and really that picture is or was your life as a pastor.
Absolutely.
Building a church, building something that changed the world, but the pylons, or whatever you call them, weren't deep enough to sustain the outer world, and that began to crack. I think that happens with so many of us. Really, I do. I believe, and you're just being so honest about it. But what were the other? The first one was facing your shadow.
Second is lead out of your marriage or singleness. And the quality that you're actually investing in, the quality of, if you're married, to your marriage, or if you're single, into a quality singleness, because Christian marriage is different than secular marriage, and Christian singleness is very different than secular singleness. But also it takes reflection and time to actually build or get discipled in marriage or singleness in such a way that it's a sign and a wonder and a gift to the world. I don't know if you want to talk about that. Pause on that. You want to come back to it?
Go to the next pylon.
And the third one is slowing down for loving union with Jesus. I actually slow down my life, so I'm actually cultivating a first-hand relationship with Jesus. And the fourth is I've got a rhythm of work and Sabbath. My life is not just work, but I'm actually able to stop and delight and let God run the world and not try to control everything, but actually stop for a 24-hour period each week. It's a spiritual discipline, a practice of Sabbath keeping before God.
Those are powerful. And it's interesting, like last night we had 3 hours at the dinner table after church service, and they were coaching us about our marriage. And it's so interesting because as I thought about it, we received some very powerful tips about how to take our marriage to the next level. But as I thought about what's keeping us from doing that, you know what it is? It's busyness. We're so busy building the upper that we can't take the time to go to one of these pylons and deepen it to lead more out of a stronger marriage. It's not that the desire is not there, and even it's not that we don't know what we should do. We're so busy. We're so busy. And to build into the inner life, it takes discipline, but you guys have taught me that it's really the most valuable thing you can do for yourself, for your marriage, for the next generation, for your church, for the world. And I think in America we have a problem from top to bottom, and it's all the outer life. It's this big structure, it's this big show, it's like a giant reality TV show. And beneath it, the character of people is so shallow and so thin. And then we watch it every day on TV and the news, people's lives falling apart. Our country kind of falling apart in so many ways. And you know what I think it is? A lack of attention to the beneath the iceberg stuff. So I don't know, you guys have changed the game for us and for a lot of people. Let's do this. I want to take the last 10 minutes and talk about different categories of people. I want to talk about married people, single people, leadership kind of people, and I want to talk about young people real quick. So let's talk about married people first. How does this change the game for a husband and wife? And as you've pointed out, it only takes one person to change the dance, right?
Right.
Just start ripping up those God cards, stand up on the bed in the middle of the night and say, I quit.
Yeah.
How does it change your marriage and improve it?
When we went away and we spent time with those wise mentors who helped us begin to see what was going on, once we began to be in touch with and be able to process and be honest about what was going on inside of us, we fell in love. So you rediscover yourself, and then we rediscovered one another. We learned how to truly not be just present with ourselves, but be present with one another. So this is a foundation for marriage. And one of the most important verses, one of the most beautiful verses in Scripture is they were naked and they had no shame. God calls married couples to cleave to one another. And that includes nakedness. I mean, shame is one of the worst things as a result of the fall. And yet, when we are able to be naked with one another, and when I talk about nakedness, I'm talking about emotional nakedness, spiritual nakedness, and then, of course, physical nakedness. But it's the emotional nakedness and the spiritual nakedness in which we are loving each other and entering each other's worlds deeply. And that it just creates such a unity of our heart. But it's a process. It takes discipleship. It takes skills to even know how to do that, how to listen and how to speak, how to listen deeply to each other, how to speak respectfully to one another, how to celebrate our differences, but also know how to negotiate our differences, how to address our triggers that are kind of emotional allergies from the past. And so marriage, Christian marriage, is a process of discipleship in which we are becoming more and more one flesh. Not the same, not enmeshed. Oneness is not becoming the same people. Oneness is about unity of heart. And then, of course, the physical nakedness is the expression. When we have physical nakedness or our sexual embrace, we're saying with our bodies, what we're doing is, it's a language that this is an expression of the unity of our hearts. And actually, it's an expression of a renewal of our wedding vows. So our sexual embrace, that nakedness is so important because it's the expression of the other two nakednesses, the spiritual and the emotional. And we're saying, I love you, all of you. I love you freely. And I love you forever.
This is not an advertisement, but this is why our 3 courses, Living Well, Listening Well, Loving Well, the third one's the marriage course, because we've taken all this stuff and built it into a marriage course. And that's why we're trying to get everybody to take this course, married or not, because it uses marriage as the context to see how all this stuff plays out. Talk about singlehood.
So just like marriages, a Christian marriage is meant to be a sign and a wonder that points to Christ. It's distinct. Same with singleness. Single spirituality is, we're all married to Christ, all of us. Now, I'm sure in this room, many of you are single. A few people are called to singleness for life. Some take vows for that. But the large majority of singles would like to meet somebody, which is wonderful, which is, God-given. But while you're still single, it's a calling. It's part of your vocation. It's the way you're following Jesus for now. And so you just don't jump around and you're not sleeping around with everybody to make connections. You're actually you're developing community, healthy community. Again, it comes out of part of how do I learn to bond and connect with people in a healthy way with the opposite sex without having to hook up to do that. How do I bring Christ to the breadth of the people I'm in touch with? We like to say that marriages are a visible sign of the depth of the love of Jesus, because you're called for life to love just one person deeply. And it's got a whole, nakedness component. Singles give testimony to the breadth of the love of Jesus, because singles, in a sense, are able to love a much larger number of people. And so we bear witness differently. Singles need marriage, and marriage needs singles to be a healthy church. But both are callings different than what the culture is offering us, and require discipleship.
And then in terms of the leaders, whether they're leading a team or a classroom or a business or a church or leading anything, secular writers have said that emotional quotient, EQ, is the most significant indicator of effectiveness as a leader.
Yes.
That's what you're talking about in your leadership book.
Yes.
It's powerful.
Yeah, we're talking about, this is not EQ. If you just look at EQ, and maybe some of you have done that at the workplace, it's all good. It's really good. But it's primarily about, improve your emotional intelligence so that we can get along better at work and accomplish, make more money and accomplish the mission. But it only goes so deep. It's to really manage the workplace in order to go forward. Emotional spirituality is about character change. It's about life change that permeates all of your life. And so it takes you into areas that are much deeper than emotional intelligence in the workplace, the business world. But we all have influence. And the world needs leaders. I mean, we're to be salt and light and make a difference in the world. We all have influence. We all, in a sense, are leaders on different levels. But more so, the greater leadership or influence you have, the greater need for you to take time to let God transform your inner life. And your self-awareness, your practices, your marriage or singleness, how you're operating behind closed doors. That's what impacts planning and decision-making, and culture and team building, and how you exercise power and build an organization. They're not inseparable. They're tightly linked. And so discipleship for you personally is going to have large impact in your leadership and the kind of teams that you build.
It's huge. It'll change the environment that you lead, and then the people within your team. This book, Emotionally Healthy Leader, we went through it as a staff team this summer. We're thinking about adding a 4th course to our life studies. Living well is the introduction to emotionally healthy spirituality. Listening well helps you just learn listening skills, which you can use in relationships. Loving well is the marriage course. We're thinking about adding leading well, because so many people in our community are leaders and could benefit from learning how this works out. It's very powerful. The last group I really like you to speak to, because, you know, next generation people, young people, are leaving the church in large numbers, and a lot of it has to do with they can smell hypocrisy from a mile away. Yeah. They can see facades, and I think they're longing for what you're offering, something that's deep and transformative. Speak just, if you could, for a moment about how this can change the lives of young people and even parent-child relationships.
Honey, why don't you talk about this story you told the other day about we taught the CTR to singles, dating couples.
So Pete and I had done a dating seminar at our church, and we noticed before we got up to speak, I mean, most of the, whether they were single or they're with a boyfriend or girlfriend, you know, nobody was talking to each other. You know, they were just all on their phones. But when we stood up to speak, then they, you know, gave their attention, and we gave them a skill. We taught them a skill, and basically the skill is you have to turn to one another. You have to have a partner. You turn to one another, and then you share in 5 categories that are important to relationship. And afterwards, one couple came up to us, and they said, "You know what? We never realized that we never look at each other when we talk to each other." Most of their conversation happens through texting. And so for many of the singles in that room, those younger people, the next generation, it was awkward. It was really awkward for them to kind of do this exercise, but at the same time, they loved it. And we've been getting that kind of response from youth, young adults, that they're longing for connection. And you know, our culture right now, we all know what social media is doing to actual human connection.
You know, it's been rightly said that every generation brings a gift. I think the next generation, millennials, and they have a tremendous passion for connection and to change the world. They just don't know how to do it. And so emotional healthy relationships and with these 8 skills, part of this discipleship is, how do I have healthy connections? How do I do a clean fight? How do I speak clearly, respectfully, honestly, and in a timely fashion? But the way that we do relationships is radically different than the world. And so we realized we had to break it down. And so for young people, we find they flock to emotional spirituality for 2 reasons. One is it's very broken, and they don't want pretense, and they're looking for reality. So you're right, if you're not into being broken, if you're putting up a mask and want to be pretentious, it is not for you. But if you're open to being real and authentic and not hiding and letting Christ actually in your whole life, you will find great energy in it. But secondly, it's about relationships, about how do I bond with folks? How do I move out of reactivity, blaming, isolation, being so triggered, again, dirty fighting, to actually engage. And so that's a big part of EHS. And so we find, if anything, we have a problem. There's so many young people that want a piece of it because they're longing for healthy connections. And they come out of my generation with divorces, and we didn't do it well. And they grew up in families without it doing well, and they're longing for it. And so I think it's a great opportunity from God to address the need because my prayer is the next generation is going to get on our shoulders and do greater things than we did. I think that's the heart of God.
That's powerful. And you discovered when you were something like 50 that you were emotionally 10. So I'm roughing the numbers, but imagine if you discovered you were emotionally 10 when you were 10.
Absolutely.
And your parents had helped you learn how to deal with self-image and anger and sadness and grief and loss, and taught you to deal with the inner life. And I think that's a huge piece of this, is if parents get it and couples get it, it changes how you deal with your children at any stage. It's changing how Shirley and I are dealing with our adult children who are all now up into their 30s.
Yep.
Totally a game changer. So I believe you guys have taught us how to bring our authentic self into real union with Jesus, slow down and really bring the true self into union, and then how to bring that into loving union with other people. It's been a game changer for us.
Yes.
I want to thank you too for your vulnerability in the books, because I think that's really what caught our attention, is the honest stories about the swimming pool and the quitting, and Pete saying, I felt like I was an emotional infant as a pastor. Thanks for being open and vulnerable and bringing that to the world. Let's thank these guys for
Thank
being
you.
I've already mentioned we have these courses. They're filling up fast. The Living Well course only can take 180 people. It meets on a Sunday. It also meets on a Monday night, starting up in a week or two. I just encourage you to take the next step. We're going to do something right now that I want you to enjoy, and I want you to use this as a moment of reflection. Here's what we're going to do. The band's going to come and sing a special song about how God takes brokenness, and if we're willing to bring it to him, if we hide our brokenness, it stays hidden. But if we're willing to bring our brokenness out into the light of God's love and relationship with other people, he can take brokenness and make it into something beautiful. And that's what God does, because that's all God has to work with, is brokenness. Everybody's broken. And we sincerely want to be a church where it's okay to be broken, because we all are. And if you hear me talking about my own brokenness or our brokenness or us needing help, that's just because we're being honest. And we want you all to just feel like in this church, no shame for where you are, but no shame a year from now. These guys last night challenged us with 3 skills. We felt no shame for where we were as a couple talking to them last night, but they gave us 3 things that if we don't do by a year from now, if we do them, we'll never be the same. No shame, no shame. Let's do that together. But as you hear this song, just listen and maybe pray to God. God, what's my next step? How can you take my brokenness and turn it into a thing of beauty? Just sit and reflect. And Lord, we offer these moments to you. Just take the words that have been spoken, the stories that have been told, and whisper to each person something about what to do, what's next, how to respond. We offer these moments to you, Holy Spirit, and that you would speak. In Jesus' name.
Will your grace run out if I let you down? 'Cause all I know is how to run. 'Cause I am a sinner. If it's not one thing, it's another. Caught up in words, tangled in lies. But you are a savior, and you take brokenness aside and make it beautiful. you are a savior when you take brokenness aside.